In the summer of 1944, a German officer, who had spent 3 years on the Eastern Front fighting the Red Army, and who had survived some of the most brutal combat in the history of warfare, wrote in his diary that nothing he had experienced in Russia had prepared him for what the Americans were doing to his unit in the hedgerows of Normandy, and the specific thing the Americans were doing was not what you would expect from an army that had been fighting for less than 3 years, and that German commanders had initially dismissed as inexperienced and tactically unsophisticated and fundamentally unsuited to the kind of close combat warfare that the European theater demanded, and the tactic that was systematically breaking German units in the Bocage of Normandy was something that the Wehrmacht had invented and perfected, and that was now being used against them with a skill and a ferocity and an organizational sophistication that their own doctrine had never anticipated encountering from this direction, and it was called combined arms integration, and by the time the Germans fully understood exactly how effectively the Americans had learned to do it, the war in the West was already irreversibly lost, and the question of what happened next was no longer in doubt. To understand why this mattered so much and why it changed everything about how the war in Western Europe unfolded, you need to understand what the German army believed about the American military in the years before Normandy, and why those beliefs were not entirely wrong when they were formed, and why they were catastrophically wrong by the time they needed to be accurate. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it had an army that was tiny by the standards of the major European powers, and that had been expanded rapidly from the skeletal force of the 1930s into something that looked like a large modern military from the outside, but that was in many important respects still a collection of civilians in uniform who had been given equipment and organization, but who had not yet developed the institutional knowledge and the combat experience that turns an organized group of armed men into a genuinely effective fighting force capable of operating against a competent and experienced enemy. The men filling the ranks of the American Army in 1941 and 1942 were mostly people who had been in uniform for months rather than years, and whose experience of military life extended to training exercises and garrison duty rather than to the specific and irreplaceable education of actual combat against enemies who were trying to kill them. The officers commanding at every level from platoon to corps were mostly men who had never led soldiers against a competent adversary and who were working from doctrinal manuals and training exercises rather than from the accumulated practical knowledge of what modern industrial warfare actually looked like when you were in the middle of it rather than reading about it. The Germans had been fighting since September 1939 and had by 1941 accumulated nearly 4 years of continuous combat experience against opponents who had forced them to develop and refine their tactical methods under the most demanding possible conditions. They had learned at enormous cost in men and equipment and institutional energy what worked and what did not work against a range of adversaries, from the armies of Poland and France and North Africa and Yugoslavia to the Red Army, which had proven to be a completely different and in many ways far more challenging opponent than any of the Western European forces, and they had built over those years of continuous combat experience an army that was in many respects the most tactically sophisticated military organization in the world in terms of the ability of small units and junior officers to make rapid decisions and execute complex operations without constant supervision from above and without waiting for permission from higher headquarters to respond to tactical opportunities as they developed. The principle of Auftragstaktik, or mission command, that was the philosophical foundation of German tactical doctrine, was the institutional expression of a genuinely superior approach to the problem of military command in conditions of uncertainty and chaos and rapid change. The idea was that commanders at every level should be told what their commander wanted to accomplish, and should then be free to use their own judgment about how to accomplish it based on their understanding of the situation on the ground, rather than waiting for specific orders that would inevitably be based on information that was already outdated by the time the orders arrived. This approach produced faster decision-making and better adaptation to the specific conditions of individual tactical situations than the more hierarchical and more centrally controlled command systems of most of its adversaries, and it had been demonstrated to be genuinely superior in campaign after campaign from the fall of France in 1940 to the initial phases of Barbarossa in 1941. When German commanders assessed the American army in the early phases of the war in North Africa, where the two forces first encountered each other in significant numbers, they saw an army that was making exactly the kind of mistakes that inexperienced armies make against experienced opponents, and they drew conclusions from what they observed that were partially correct about the current state of American military capability, but that were dangerously wrong about the trajectory of development that the American army was on, and about how rapidly and how thoroughly it would correct the problems that German observers correctly identified in its early performance. The Americans were losing tactical engagements in North Africa in 1942 and early 1943 at a rate that seemed to confirm the German assessment of their limitations. They were making errors of judgment and errors of coordination that experienced soldiers would not have made in the same situations. They were taking casualties in circumstances that could have been avoided with better tactical awareness and better unit cohesion, and some German commanders drew from this pattern of tactical failures the conclusion that the Americans were fundamentally unsuited to the kind of close combat warfare that the war in Europe would demand, and that the cultural and institutional characteristics of American society made it unlikely that the American army would develop the tactical qualities that the German assessment considered essential. What those German commanders missed and what their assessments almost entirely failed to anticipate was something that in retrospect seems obvious, but that required a degree of analytical honesty about the trajectory of American military development that German commanders found difficult to sustain, because it conflicted with both their professional pride and their preconceptions about American military culture. The Americans were not trying to win the war by outfighting German infantry in close combat on German terms, because they had correctly identified that fighting German infantry in close combat on German terms in exactly the way that German doctrine was designed to handle was not where American advantages were greatest, and that attempting to do so would produce casualties at rates that American domestic political opinion would not sustain for the duration of a long war. The Americans had enormous, and in many cases insurmountable advantages in artillery production and delivery, and in air power that was increasingly capable of operating in direct support of ground operations, and in the logistical infrastructure that allowed them to sustain high-tempo operations over extended periods, and in the industrial production capacity that allowed them to replace losses in equipment far more rapidly than their German adversaries could. And the central question that American commanders and American military planners were working through intensively in 1943 and early 1944 was how to translate those material advantages into tactical and operational results on the ground against an enemy that was genuinely and demonstrably superior in certain specific dimensions of close combat warfare. The answer they developed and refined through the campaigns in North Africa and Sicily and Italy, and then implemented at scale in Normandy, was not a new invention in the sense of a tactical concept that had never occurred to anyone before, but rather a more systematic and more effectively implemented and more thoroughly integrated version of something that military theorists had been discussing and experimenting with since the end of the First World War, which was the integration of different combat arms into combined teams that could support each other in ways that multiplied the effectiveness of each individual element beyond what any of them could achieve operating independently against the full range of problems that modern combined arms defensive systems presented to attacking forces. The idea of combined arms warfare was not something that only the Americans understood, and it was not something that the Germans did not practice, because the Germans had been practicing combined arms integration since the early campaigns of the war and had in many ways pioneered its modern application in the blitzkrieg operations that had so dramatically demonstrated its potential. The difference was not in the concept itself, but in the level of the tactical hierarchy at which integration was achieved, and in the communications infrastructure that made real-time coordination between dispersed elements possible, and in the institutional culture that determined how willing different branches of the military were to subordinate their individual preferences and their institutional identities to the requirements of combined team performance. The American solution to the problem of combined arms integration was to build combined arms teams at the lowest practical tactical level. Teams that integrated infantry and tanks and artillery and tank destroyers and engineers, and in many operations close air support into formations that were trained to work together, and that had the communications equipment to coordinate in real time, and that were expected to solve the tactical problems they encountered on the ground using the resources available within the team, rather than waiting for higher headquarters to coordinate the different elements separately in a process that was inevitably slower and less responsive to the specific conditions that the team encountered. The radio was the technological foundation that made this approach possible, and the Americans had radios in quantities and at levels of the tactical hierarchy that genuinely distinguished their communications infrastructure from every other army in the war, including the Germans, who had sophisticated radio equipment, but who distributed it more sparsely through their tactical formations and who relied more heavily on telephone landlines that were vulnerable to artillery fire and on messenger systems that could not transmit information quickly enough to allow the kind of real-time coordination between widely separated elements that the American combined arms system required to function effectively. American infantry companies and tank platoons and artillery batteries all had radios that allowed them to communicate directly with each other, and this density of communications at the lowest tactical levels was not simply a convenience or a nice-to-have capability. It was the physical infrastructure that made genuine combined arms integration possible in the fluid and rapidly changing conditions of actual combat, where the situation on the ground could change in minutes in ways that no predetermined plan could anticipate, and that required immediate communication between all of the elements that needed to respond to the change. In the hedgerows of Normandy in the summer of 1944, the Americans encountered a specific defensive challenge that the Bocage terrain presented to attacking forces, and that was genuinely different from anything that the training exercises and doctrinal manuals had prepared them for, because the Bocage was a terrain type that existed almost nowhere else in the world and that had characteristics that turned the standard American offensive doctrine into a formula for producing casualties without corresponding progress. The hedgerows were ancient earthen walls topped with dense vegetation that had divided the Norman agricultural landscape for centuries, and that had been built to a height and a thickness that made them essentially impenetrable to vehicles that attempted to drive through them rather than finding the narrow gaps that the local farmers used to move between fields. The hedgerows provided German defenders with a network of prepared defensive positions that were almost invisible from the front because the earthen walls and the dense vegetation provided both concealment and cover that was immune to direct fire from most angles, and that made identifying and engaging specific defensive positions extremely difficult for attacking forces that needed to identify targets before they could engage them. Each hedgerow-enclosed field was essentially a small fortress that needed to be cleared before the attacking force could advance to the next field and begin the process again. And there were thousands of these small fortresses across the Bocage terrain of Normandy. The standard American tactical approach when encountering a hedgerow defended by German infantry was to have the infantry attempt to fight through it with fire and movement, while the tanks attempted to find gaps or work around the flanks to create opportunities for the infantry to advance. The problem with this approach was that the gaps in the hedgerows were exactly the points that German anti-tank weapons were positioned to cover, because the German defenders understood the terrain and had prepared their defensive positions to take maximum advantage of the way the terrain would force attacking forces to move, and that tanks advancing through the gaps were immediately engaging German anti-tank weapons at ranges that gave the defensive weapons significant advantages. The improvisation and adaptation that the American Army went through in those first weeks in the Bocage was one of the most rapid and most consequential examples of institutional military learning under combat conditions in the history of modern warfare, and it happened at multiple levels of the military hierarchy simultaneously rather than being directed from the top down in the way that institutional change in military organizations usually happens. Individual soldiers and squad leaders and platoon commanders were experimenting with different approaches and reporting what worked and what did not work, and those reports were moving up the chain of command and being synthesized into new tactical guidance that was then disseminated back down to the units that needed it. Sergeant Curtis Culin is the individual most often credited with a specific technical innovation that became one of the key enablers of the American hedgerow clearing tactics, which was the idea of welding steel tines cut from the German anti-landing obstacles that had been installed on the Normandy beaches to the front of Sherman tanks to create a device that could cut through the roots of hedgerow walls and allow tanks to drive directly through the earthen walls rather than having to go through or around the gaps that the defenders were covering. But Culin's innovation was only one component of a broader tactical evolution that involved the integration of multiple elements in a systematic sequence designed to suppress and destroy German defensive positions before the infantry was required to close with them. The tactical sequence that evolved from weeks of costly combat in the Bocage represented the most complete implementation of combined arms integration that the American Army had yet achieved at the small unit level, and it went something like this. The position to be attacked would first be subjected to observed artillery fire directed by forward observers who were positioned to see the effects of the fire and to adjust it onto specific defensive positions rather than simply firing into the general area of the objective. Then, if the situation permitted, and if forward air controllers were available, fighter bombers would be called in to attack specific positions that the artillery could not easily engage or that needed to be destroyed rather than simply suppressed. Then Sherman tanks equipped with the Culin hedgerow cutter device would advance to cut through the hedgerow wall at a point that was not one of the pre-existing gaps that the defenders were covering, while other tanks provided direct fire support to suppress German positions on the flanks that might otherwise be able to engage the advancing tanks. Then infantry would follow the tanks through the new gap using the tanks as mobile cover, while the artillery shifted its fire to protect the flanks of the advancing force against counterattacks, and the process would begin again for the next hedgerow and the next field beyond it. The key to making the sequence work efficiently and with acceptable casualties was the fire support coordination that allowed each element to begin its contribution at exactly the right moment and to stop at exactly the right moment to allow the next element to contribute without risk of friendly fire casualties that were always a danger when artillery was firing close to friendly troops and when tanks and infantry were advancing toward positions that fighter bombers had just attacked, and This coordination was only possible because of the communications network that allowed infantry company commanders to talk directly to tank platoon commanders and to artillery fire direction centers, and in some cases to forward air controllers who could direct close air support onto targets that they could see from the ground in real time as the situation evolved. German commanders observing the system in operation found it deeply unsettling in ways that went beyond ordinary tactical frustration with a specific defensive challenge. What they were watching was an opponent that had taken the combined arms principles that German doctrine had pioneered well and was implementing them more effectively at the small unit tactical level than German units were able to do because the American communications infrastructure provided coordination. Capabilities at the squad and platoon and company level that German units could not match, and because the American industrial production system provided the volume of artillery ammunition and the number of supporting aircraft and the quantity of petroleum products needed to sustain this kind of fire-heavy, resource-intensive tactical approach indefinitely in a way that the increasingly strained German logistical system simply could not. A German infantry battalion defending a hedgerow position in July 1944 was being subjected to a weight of coordinated fire from multiple different systems that its defensive doctrine had not been designed to deal with, because the doctrine had been developed at a time when no adversary had combined the specific capabilities that the Americans were bringing to bear. The density of American artillery support in Normandy was substantially greater than anything the Germans had faced in the Eastern theater, and the quality of fire direction and the precision with which fires could be shifted and concentrated had improved dramatically from the early days of the campaign as American artillery units accumulated experience and refined their techniques. The breakout from Normandy that began with Operation Cobra in late July 1944 was the demonstration of what the American combined arms system could accomplish when given sufficient room to maneuver, and when the learning process of the Bocage fighting had been institutionalized into tactical doctrine that units could execute with the consistency and the confidence that successful tactical operations required. The carpet bombing that preceded the ground assault was the most concentrated tactical air bombardment in history to that point, and it was followed by an armored exploitation through the gap that developed with a speed and an operational reach that covered more ground in less time than any previous American offensive operation in the war. Patton's Third Army moved through the gap created by the initial assault and began the wide sweeping movement around the German left flank that led to the encirclement at the Falaise Pocket, where a substantial portion of the German forces that had been fighting in Normandy were surrounded and destroyed or forced to escape through a narrowing corridor under constant air and artillery attack that inflicted casualties on the retreating German forces. That significantly reduced the capacity of the German army in the West to resist the subsequent American advance into Germany. The German commanders who attempted to organize a coherent response to the American breakout operation found themselves in the position of trying to make decisions and move forces against an opponent that was operating at a pace and a geographic scale that the German command and communication system could not keep up with. American exploitation forces were moving faster than German intelligence could track them, and faster than German commanders could process the information that was reaching them and issue orders based on that information. And by the time German units received orders to move to cover a penetration, the penetration had already expanded beyond the point that the ordered movement would be able to address. The logistical system that the Americans developed to support the advance from Normandy toward Germany demonstrated another dimension of American organizational capability that German commanders found difficult to counter because it operated at a scale and with a degree of flexibility that the German logistical doctrine had not anticipated as a practical possibility. The Red Ball Express was a truck convoy system that kept the advancing American columns supplied with fuel and ammunition across supply lines that extended hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches, and that grew longer every day as the advance continued deeper into France and then toward the German border. The German army that confronted the Americans in the Ardennes in December 1944 was not the same army that had faced the first waves at Omaha Beach in June, because it had been fighting continuously for 6 months against an opponent that was becoming more effective every week, while the German army was losing in every battle the experienced officers and NCOs and enlisted men who could not be replaced in sufficient numbers to maintain the tactical quality that had made the Wehrmacht so formidable. In the early years of the war, the replacements who filled the gaps were younger and less experienced, and were commanded by officers whose training had been compressed and abbreviated by the manpower pressures that left the army chronically short of qualified leaders at every level. The Ardennes Offensive initially succeeded in creating the kind of confusion and disruption that German operational planning was designed to exploit, because the attack achieved a degree of surprise that temporarily overwhelmed the American defensive system in the sector where the main blow fell, and because the bad weather that grounded Allied air power in the first days of the offensive removed the American advantage that had been most consistently decisive in slowing and disrupting German movement during the preceding months. But the American recovery from the initial shock of the German offensive was itself a demonstration of how much the American army had changed since June 1944. Units that were surrounded and cut off continued to fight rather than collapsing, and the defense of Bastogne by the 101st Airborne Division became one of the defining moments of American military performance in the war, not because of the dramatic exchanges with German officers demanding surrender, but because of the grinding daily reality of a lightly equipped airborne division holding a critical road junction against repeated attacks by German armored forces with superior equipment for days. Without resupply and without any certainty that relief was coming in time, the division held not because of some special quality of American spirit that had not been present in earlier units, but because it had absorbed enough combat experience and had enough institutional confidence in its own capabilities to continue functioning under conditions of extreme pressure and uncertainty. When the weather cleared and the American air power returned, the balance shifted back immediately in ways that confirmed how completely the German offensive had depended on the absence of the air support that the Americans had come to rely on as a standard component of their combined arms system. The German armored formations that had been advancing through Belgium were suddenly exposed to fighter-bomber attacks that they had no effective means of defending against, and the correlation of losses shifted back to the pattern that had been established in Normandy and that German commanders had come to dread because it represented an asymmetry in the rate of loss that the German army could not sustain. What the German commanders who wrote their memoirs after the war consistently underemphasized when they explained their defeats in 1944 and 1945 was the degree to which the American army they faced in the later stages of the war was qualitatively different from the American army they had dismissed with some justice in North Africa in 1942 and early 1943. The learning process that the American army had undergone was one of the most remarkable institutional transformations under combat pressure in the history of modern warfare, because it had taken an organization that was genuinely inferior in certain important dimensions of military effectiveness and had converted it through sustained experience and systematic reflection on that experience into an organization that could match German tactical skills while simultaneously exploiting material advantages that no amount of tactical quality on the German side could fully compensate for. The combination of tactical competence that had been developed through 2 years of increasingly difficult combat and material superiority in artillery and air power and logistics, and the communications infrastructure that allowed all of these advantages to be integrated and coordinated in real time at the lowest tactical levels created something that German doctrine had not provided its commanders with effective tools for dealing with, and that German production could not provide its soldiers with the equipment to counter across the full range of capabilities that the American combined arms system could bring to bear simultaneously. Write in the comments which part of this changed the way you understand what the American army actually was by the end of the Second World War, because I want to know exactly when this stopped being a story about whether the Sherman tank was good enough and became a story about the organizational transformation that turned an inexperienced and in some respects genuinely inferior military force into something that German commanders who had spent their careers fighting the best armies in Europe found genuinely difficult to defeat on any terms they could dictate.